Chapter 1. The Mystery of the Parchment. Late one Sunday afternoon in May 1863, my uncle, Professor Lidenbrook, came home early. We lived in a house in the city of Hamburg. He was very excited. Martha, our cook, was worried. "Why is Professor Lidenbrook here so early?" she cried. "His dinner isn't ready yet." I told Martha not to worry, and she went back to the kitchen. I started to go upstairs to my room, but Uncle Otto's voice stopped me. "Axel, come here," he shouted. I entered his room. My uncle was sitting at his desk. He was looking at an old book. "Look at this," he exclaimed. "What a fantastic book! It's more than 600 years old. It's wonderful." "What is this wonderful book called?" I asked. But my uncle did not hear me at first. He kept opening and shutting the book and talking about it to himself. I repeated my question. "This book is a translation of a famous Icelandic book. It was written by Snorri Sturluson in the 12th century. Ah, what's this?" A piece of parchment fell out of the book. There were strange letters written on it. My uncle picked it up and looked at it. He became even more excited. "Look, it's written in runes." "What are runes, Uncle?" I asked. "Runes are the letters of the old Icelandic alphabet, of course," my uncle replied impatiently. "I can read runes, but I can't understand this. What does it mean?" And he began to talk to himself again. I was used to that because my Uncle Otto was a little strange sometimes. He gave lectures at the University of Hamburg. He was a famous geologist. He knew more about the earth than any other scientist. Other geologists came from all over the world to learn from him. I learned about geology from him. He was a very good teacher. When my parents died, I came to live with him. I often helped him in his work. I was proud to be the assistant of such a famous man. He started to walk up and down the room with the parchment in his hand. He looked puzzled. When he was puzzled, he usually became angry. He was getting angry now. Martha opened the door of the study. "The soup is ready, Professor," she said. "Okay," shouted my uncle. Martha closed the door and ran back to the kitchen. I followed her and sat down to dinner. Martha was a very good cook, and I was hungry. I was just finishing my dinner when my uncle called my name again. I got up from the table immediately and rushed back to his study. My uncle was sitting at his desk. He was staring at the parchment. "These are runes," he said, "but the letters are mixed up. That is why I cannot understand it. It is written in a secret code, and there is something else." "What?" I asked. "The book and the parchment are not written in the same handwriting. The writing of the parchment is later than the writing of the book. Therefore, I think that this parchment was written by someone who owned the book." My uncle continued to stare at the writing on the parchment. Then he used a magnifying glass to make the letters bigger. He looked at the parchment again. He pointed to a line of letters. "Arn Saknussemm," he exclaimed. "Oh, that's an Icelandic name. Saknussemm was a famous Icelandic scientist of the 16th century. He made many great scientific discoveries. He must have owned this book." "But why should Arn Saknussemm want to hide what he had discovered?" I asked. "Why should he keep it secret?" "I don't know," my uncle replied, "but I'm going to find out. I will neither eat nor sleep until I have discovered the secret." My uncle guessed that the message was written in Latin and not Icelandic. Scientists of the 16th century always wrote about their discoveries in Latin. He tried reading the letters forwards, then backwards, but they still made no sense. He hit his desk with his fist. "That's not it," he cried. "It doesn't make any sense," and he ran out of the house and slammed the door behind him. Martha and I watched him go. "He has gone without his dinner," she said. "He will starve." Chapter 2. Mystery Solved. When Martha had gone, I picked up the parchment and studied it. I tried to arrange the letters so that they formed Latin words, but it was impossible. I tried every combination of letters I could think of, but I still couldn't make any sense of it. I became hot. I felt I couldn't breathe, so I picked up the parchment and started to fan myself with it. While I was sitting in front of the window, I saw the back of the parchment and then the front. Suddenly I saw some Latin words which I knew. Criterem, a crater, terrestra, of the earth. You can imagine how excited I was. I had broken the secret code. At last I calmed down. Now let's see what it says, I said to myself. I spread the parchment out in front of the window and started to read it. I managed to understand all of it. For some moments I sat there without moving. I was frightened by what I had read. Was it possible? Had this really happened? Had some man really been brave enough to do this? And then I jumped up out of my seat. "Oh no!" I cried. "My uncle must not find out about this. When he reads this, he will want to do it himself. He will want to take me with him. We will never return to Hamburg. I must stop him from reading it." I took the parchment over to the fire. I was just going to burn it when the door opened and my uncle appeared. I just had time to put the parchment back on the table. My uncle did not see me. He was still thinking about the secret message. He studied the parchment all night. I fell asleep on the couch. When I woke up, it was morning. My uncle was still staring at the parchment. His face was white and his eyes were red. I felt sorry for him. I knew the secret of the parchment, but I could not tell my uncle. I knew he would want to follow in the footsteps of the old Icelandic scientist. That would be very dangerous. The morning passed. There was no breakfast and no lunch. I was very hungry. I started to change my mind about telling him of my discovery. Surely I could stop him from making such a dangerous journey. About 2 o'clock, my uncle put on his hat to go out. I decided to tell him. "Uncle Lidenbrock," I said, "have you found the secret of the code?" He said nothing, but he shook his head and stared at me. "I think I have found the answer," I said. I showed him the words I had written down. "Go down into the crater of Sneffels, which the shadow of Scartaris touches before July. Then you will reach the centre of the earth. I have done this. An Saknussemm." When my uncle read this, he gave a great cry and jumped to his feet. Books flew everywhere. He walked up and down for a few moments. Then he turned to me. He asked me the time. I told him it was 3 o'clock. My uncle was surprised. "Is that the time?" he asked. "We must have some lunch and then pack my box." "What?" I asked. "After that, pack your own box," he said. I tried to tell my uncle of the dangers of the journey, but he would not listen, and he walked out of the room. We ate lunch together, and then he called me into his study. "Axel," he said kindly, "you are a very clever young man, and you have helped me greatly. I will not forget this. Now bring me that atlas from the bookshelf." I did as my uncle asked. He showed me the places Arne had written about on the map of Iceland. I saw that Sneffels was a huge mountain, nearly 2,000 meters high. "But this mountain is a volcano. You can't go down into the center of a volcano. You would die of the heat," I said. My uncle smiled. "But Sneffels is an extinct volcano. It has not erupted since the year 1229. Now it is quite cold. Sneffels has several craters. Only one leads to the center of the earth. Arne tells us that the mountain Scartaris casts its shadow over this crater at the end of June. But everyone knows that the center of the earth is very hot. It is impossible to go there and come back alive." My uncle smiled. "Impossible, is it? Well, we are scientists, and we should go there and see for ourselves. We leave for Iceland the day after tomorrow." Chapter 3. The journey starts. The next day we prepared for our journey. Guns, tools, and scientific instruments arrived all day and were packed into boxes. Poor Martha watched this activity. "Professor Lidenbrook has taken you away," she said. "Is he mad?" I nodded. "Where are you going?" I pointed down towards the centre of the earth. "To the cellar?" Martha asked. "No, Martha," I replied. "Farther down than that." At last everything was packed up, and we set off on our journey. We travelled by steamer to Copenhagen. There we met a Danish scientist who gave us letters of introduction to the most important men in Iceland. From Copenhagen we sailed north to Iceland. The sea was very rough, and my uncle was seasick for most of the voyage. But when we arrived in Reykjavik, the capital of Iceland, he was happy and excited. He did not want to explore Reykjavik. "The most interesting part of Iceland is under the ground," he said. We immediately set off for the home of Dr. Fridriksson. My uncle had a letter of introduction to him. He told Dr. Fridriksson that he was interested in exploring Iceland's geology. "That is a very interesting subject," said Dr. Fridriksson. "Iceland has many volcanoes which have not been explored. For example, look at the mountain behind us. It is called Sneffels. It has a very interesting crater, but no one ever visits it." "Really?" said my uncle. He appeared to be calm, but I knew that he was very excited. "Is this volcano extinct?" "Oh, yes," said Dr. Fridriksson. "It has not erupted for the last 600 years. "Well," said my uncle, "I think perhaps we shall explore this Fessels. What do you call it?" "Sneffels," said Dr. Fridriksson. Dr. Fridriksson was very helpful. He arranged for a guide called Hans to take us to Sneffels. I liked Hans immediately. He was a big man who moved slowly and did not say very much. My uncle liked him too. "Hans is a good man," he said, "but he does not yet know what we are going to do." "So he's coming with us to—" "Yes, Axel. Hans is coming with us to the centre of the earth." Hans helped us to pack the guns, tools, and scientific instruments we had brought with us from Hamburg. Dr. Fridriksson came to see us off and wish us good luck. Hans led us out of Reykjavik. Soon we were in the countryside. We followed a path along the coast. The countryside was bleak. There were no crops and hardly any animals. The grass was yellow, and there were large rocks everywhere. Here and there we saw a lonely farmhouse. Sometimes we had to cross inlets, and sometimes we had to wait until the tide was out before we could cross. This made my uncle very angry, because he did not want to waste any time on his journey. At night we stayed in farmhouses. The Icelanders were always pleased to see us. They gave us the best food and drink they had and refused our offers of money. We now travelled through a strange country. We walked over beds of lava. The rocks were sharp and they hurt our feet. Volcanic rocks rose up above us. They were twisted into strange shapes. At the side of the path, steam shot up from hot springs below the earth. No plants or flowers grew in this rocky land. There was nothing but bare rock. I began to feel tired, but my uncle walked very quickly. He never seemed to feel tired. As I walked, I thought about our journey to the centre of the earth. We are going to go down into the crater. Sneffels is a volcano. It has not erupted since 1229. My uncle thinks Sneffels is an extinct volcano. But perhaps it is not extinct, only sleeping. What will happen if it wakes up? What will happen to us then? After 3 more days, we reached the base of Sneffels. That night, I talked to my uncle about my fears. He told me that Sneffels would not erupt. He tried to prove this to me scientifically, but I could not understand him. I was still worried and full of fear. That night I had a terrible dream. I dreamed that I was inside a volcano. There was a great explosion, and I was shot up out of the volcano like a rocket. We climbed Sneffels for the whole of the next day. We climbed higher and higher. It was harder and harder to breathe because of the thin air. Even my uncle was tired. At 11 o'clock that night, we reached the top of the mountain. We camped at the edge of the crater. We were more than 1,500 meters above sea level. When we awoke the next morning, it was cold and clear. The whole of Iceland was spread out below us like a map. We could even see the coast of Greenland. My uncle did not have time to look at the view. We were at the top of Sneffels, on one of its 2 peaks. But which one? My uncle asked Hans what the Icelanders called this peak. Skartaris, Hans replied. My uncle was delighted. Let us enter the crater, he exclaimed. The crater of Sneffels was shaped like an ice cream cone. The opening was more than 1 kilometre wide and was about 600 metres deep. We used ropes to help us to descend. By noon, we were standing at the bottom of the crater. At the bottom of the crater, there were 3 chimneys. Each of these was about 30 metres wide. We started to explore them. Suddenly, my uncle gave a shout. He called me over. Look, he said, pointing to a large rock with some marks on it. The marks were letters, and they spelled the name of Arn Saknussemm. You see, he asked. Now do you believe me? We had to discover which of the 3 chimneys Arn Saknussemm had descended. It was the chimney which the shadow of Skartaris touched at the end of June. But there was no shadow today because there was no sun. Today was June the 25th. If it stayed cloudy until the end of June, there would be no shadow to guide us. Chapter 4. Descent down the chimney. My uncle was angry at the delay, but there was nothing he could do. For 3 days, clouds covered the sun. At last, on June 28th, we awoke to bright sunshine. At noon, the shadow of Skartaris fell on the middle of the 3 chimneys. Forward! Cried my uncle. Now our journey begins. We prepared to descend the chimney. Hans put the tools and scientific instruments into a bag, then tied the bag to a rope. He threw the rope down the chimney. My uncle leaned over the chimney to watch our supplies fall. Good, he said. Our turn now. We tied a long rope to the edge of the chimney and descended carefully. Hans went first, then my uncle, then me. The walls of the chimney were very rough. Sharp rocks stuck out at strange angles. We used these rocks to hold on to as we descended. We did not speak to each other. The only noise was the noise of loose rocks falling down into the black depths below us. At the end of 3 hours, I still could not see the bottom of the chimney, but I saw that it was getting narrower. There was hardly any light reaching us. It was getting darker and darker, but still we went down. It was nearly midnight before we reached the bottom of the chimney. It had been a long and tiring descent, and we were all exhausted. We had something to eat. I was ready to sleep, but my uncle was still excited. Axel, my boy, I have been examining the rocks as we descended. They prove that I was right. The centre of the earth cannot be hot after all. All the scientists who think that the centre of the earth is hot are wrong. I was too tired to argue. We shall see, Uncle, I said. Then I lay down and immediately fell asleep. Early next morning, a ray of sunlight woke us up. The red lava walls sparkled like jewels. Well, Axel, said my uncle, have you ever spent a more peaceful night in our little house in Hamburg? We ate our breakfast, then set off on the next stage of our journey. We entered a small passage that led off to the right. As we left the main chimney, I looked up and saw the sky of Iceland for the last time. When Sneffels had last erupted in 1229, the lava had flowed through this passage. Now it had frozen and formed strange shapes. It was like walking through a box of jewels. "It's magnificent!" I cried out. "So, are you beginning to enjoy our journey, Axel?" my uncle asked.
You will see even more beautiful things, my boy.
We struggled onwards. My uncle had brought a strong electric torch, and its light guided our way. When we stopped for the night, we were in a kind of cave, but there was plenty of air. In fact, I could feel a wind blowing through the cave. Where could it be coming from? I was too tired and hungry to worry about this question. In any case, there was something else that was worrying me. We had already used about half of our water. My uncle had expected to find underground springs of water, but so far we had not found any. I said this to my uncle.
Are you surprised that there are no springs?
He asked. Yes, I am, I replied. And I'm worried. We have only enough water for 5 days.
When we get through these lava walls, there will be plenty of water,
my uncle said. I did not agree with my uncle, but I said nothing. We set off again the next morning. At noon, we came to the end of the passage. Here it divided into 2 paths, one going east, the other west. Which path should we take? My uncle did not hesitate. He pointed to the eastern path, and Hans and I followed him into it. As I walked, I thought about the lava pouring through this narrow passage hundreds of years ago. I hoped that it would not do that again while we were in it. Chapter 5. Water found, Axel lost. We followed this passage for 3 days. As we walked, I began to feel more and more tired. At first I could not understand this, but soon I realized why I was so tired. The path was going up, not down. Also the rocks were different. We were walking through younger rocks, where plants and animals were preserved in the rocks. I said this to my uncle, but he only nodded. I became angry. I picked up the shell of an insect preserved in the rock and showed it to my uncle.
Look at this,
I said.
Well,
he said calmly,
it is the shell of an insect preserved in the rock.
But that means...
Yes, that means that we may have taken the wrong path. I may have made a mistake, but we cannot be sure until we reach the end of this passage.
So we continued to follow the eastern passage. We passed through walls of coal. I saw whole trees preserved in rock walls. But after 2 more days, we came to a blank wall ahead of us. There was no way past it. We had to go back to the crossroads and take the western passage. 3 days later, we reached the crossroads. I was tired and very thirsty. I had finished the water in my bottle. I fell to the ground. My uncle lifted me up and put his water bottle to my lips.
Poor boy,
he said.
Drink this. It is the last of the water. I have saved it for you.
Thank you, uncle, I said, and drank the last few drops of water. I immediately felt stronger. Now, uncle, I whispered, we must go back.
Back?
My uncle asked.
And give up our journey? Never.
Then we must die, I replied. I knew I would never persuade my uncle alone. I turned to Hans. He shook his head and pointed to my uncle.
Master,
he said.
Axel,
my uncle said,
give me 1 more day to find water. If we do not find water in the western passage tomorrow, we will go back together.
Well, I replied, so be it. Do as you wish. And we set off into the western passage. The passage led down through older rocks. We walked all day. I could hardly go on because of my dreadful thirst. And then I heard a noise. It was the noise of running water. Somewhere on the other side of the wall of rock there was an underground river. We put our ears to the rock. Hans moved along the wall, listening carefully to the water. Where the noise of the running water was loudest, he lifted his pickaxe and hit the rock. He worked calmly to make a hole. The rock wall was thick, but after an hour of hard work, Hans had made a large hole in the wall. My uncle was impatient. He did not want to wait. He offered to help Hans. But before he could pick up the axe, there was a hissing sound. A strong jet of water burst out of the wall of rock. It was so strong that it almost knocked Hans down. He cried out in pain when the water hit him. I put my hand into the water and soon understood why. The water was very hot, almost boiling. "The water is boiling!" I exclaimed.
"Well, in the open air it will soon cool down,"
said my uncle. The water quickly cooled down. We did not wait until it was cold before we drank it. It tasted better than any water I had ever tasted before. We drank until we were not thirsty any more. Before we left this place, we filled our bottles. We decided to leave the hole in the wall as it was. The underground river would now run beside us as we descended. It would show us the quickest way down. I felt much better. I was eager to continue our journey. I had no thoughts now of going back. The path continued westward. Now we started to go down again. The rocks were shaped like steps, and we descended quickly. Each day my uncle used his scientific instruments to calculate our position. One day he told me that we were now 200 kilometers west of our starting point.
"That means we are under the sea,"
I exclaimed.
"You are right, my boy,"
my uncle said with a smile.
"We are under the Atlantic Ocean."
We travelled more quickly now. My legs were used to walking, and I was not so easily tired. Sometimes I felt a pain in my ears, but I knew that this was due to the increased air pressure.
"Breathe quickly,"
my uncle said.
"That will relieve the pressure."
I tried this and found that my uncle was right, as usual. By August the 7th, we were 125 kilometers below the Earth's surface and about 845 kilometers from Iceland. That day, the passage descended quite gently. I was in front of Hans and the professor. The torch I carried lit our way. We walked in silence as usual. Suddenly I turned around to speak to my uncle, but he was not there. Neither was Hans. I was alone. "I have been walking too fast," I said to myself. "I'll wait for them to catch up with me." But after a quarter of an hour there was no sign of them. I called out, but there was no answer. Well, there is no need to worry, I thought. I will go back and meet them. I only need to follow the water. I bent down to put my hands in the water, but my hands touched dry rock. I was lost. I would die of hunger and thirst. "Oh, Uncle!" I cried out in despair. I decided to go back up the path. Somewhere I had taken a wrong turning. If I went back, I would find the true path. I walked upwards for half an hour. Then I walked straight into a wall of rock and fell down. I had reached a dead end. There was no way forward. I had dropped my torch when I fell down, and now it was broken. I lay in complete darkness. I stood up and ran back down the path, waving my arms and shouting like a madman. I ran against the rocks and cut myself. At last, I fell on the floor and fainted. Chapter 6. Amazing Discoveries. I don't know how long I lay there, but I was awakened by a noise. It sounded like thunder or waves crashing on the shore of a sea. But where did it come from? I listened carefully, but heard no more. Then I heard a noise that sounded like a human voice. I could make out words. I thought I heard my name, and then the word lost. Was I imagining things? But no, I heard my name again. It was my uncle's voice. "Uncle Lidenbrook!" I called out. Seconds passed like years. Then I heard these words.
"Axel! Axel! Is it you?"
Yes, I am in complete darkness."
"Axel, my boy, be brave. Listen to me. We are in a big hall. All the passages lead into this hall. We can hear each other because sound travels down the passages into the hall. Call to me again, and I will calculate how far apart we are."
I called again, and my uncle replied when he heard me. It took 20 seconds for my voice to reach my uncle. From this, he calculated that we were 6 kilometers apart.
That's not so far,
my uncle said cheerfully.
Walk down the passage, and we shall soon welcome you. It will not take long. On your way, my boy.
I was filled with hope now, and I set off eagerly. But I was very tired. The slope was very steep. I started to slide down the passage. I went faster and faster. I could not stop. The ground disappeared beneath my feet. I was falling down a well. My head hit a sharp rock, and I lost consciousness again. When I awoke, I was lying against a rock. My uncle was watching me. When I opened my eyes, he gave a cry of joy.
"He's alive! He's alive!"
he cried. "Yes," I answered weakly. He held me in his arms.
"My dear boy,"
he said,
"thank God you are safe."
My uncle told me to sleep. I slept for a long time. When I awoke, I wondered if I was still dreaming. There were no lamps, but there was light coming from somewhere, and I could hear a noise like the one that I had heard while I was lost. It was the sound of waves breaking on the shore of a sea. Where was the light coming from? What was that sound? I wanted to get up and explore. My uncle wanted to stop me, but I insisted on going. At first I saw nothing. I closed my eyes. They were not used to the light. When I opened them again, I was amazed. "The sea!" I cried.
"Yes,"
said my uncle.
"I have named it the Lidenbrock Sea."
A great stretch of water lay before me. There was a beach of golden sand. There were waves breaking on the beach. The light was strange. It was cold and white, unlike sunlight or moonlight. There was a sky with white clouds. High above the clouds there was a roof of rock. We were in a huge cave. I walked with my uncle along the shore of this strange sea. There were towers of sharp rock in the water. Along the shore there was a forest of trees which looked like giant umbrellas. As we got closer, I saw that they were giant mushrooms. We saw other plants which were much taller than they were on the surface of the earth. My uncle was excited.
"It is magnificent,"
he cried.
"Look and admire, Axel. You will never see anything like this again."
On the shore we also found the bones of animals which had long disappeared from the earth. We wandered for hours along the shore of this wonderful sea. We saw the tide rise and fall. Even here the sea answers the call of the moon. My uncle told me he intended to cross the sea. When I asked him how he intended to do this, he smiled.
"Hans is making us a raft. Come and see."
Hans had cut down some of the trees and had tied them together to make a raft. Tomorrow we would start to explore the Lidenbrock Sea. Chapter 7. Crossing the Lidenbrock Sea. The wind blew our raft along quickly. By the end of the next day we had left the coast far behind. We had travelled 145 kilometres on the Lidenbrock Sea. Hans decided to try fishing. He tied a hook onto the end of a rope, put some meat on it, and threw it into the sea. At first nothing happened. Perhaps there was no life in these waters. But then Hans felt a tug on the line. He pulled it in and landed a fish on the deck on our raft. It had a flat head but no tail. The strangest thing was that it had no eyes. My uncle examined it carefully.
"This fish belongs to a family of fish which no longer lives on earth," he said. "This fish is extinct."
I was very excited by this news. To think that we had caught a fish that only existed as a fossil on earth. I wondered what other wonderful creatures we would meet on our voyage on this sea. We might see lizards or whales or birds that lived on the earth millions of years ago. I started to dream of these fantastic creatures. It was wonderful to be out on the open sea. Our days in the darkness of the rocks under Sneffels seemed far away. My uncle tried to find out how deep the sea was. He tied a pickaxe to the end of a long rope and threw it into the sea. It did not touch the bottom, but when we pulled it up, Hans pointed to marks on the pickaxe. "Teeth," he said. What terrible monster had bitten into the iron of the pickaxe? We looked at each other in fear. Night came again, and I fell asleep. However, I was awakened suddenly. The raft had been lifted out of the water. A huge sea monster had thrown us into the air. As we looked, we saw two other sea monsters. They were coming towards us. Were they going to attack? I picked up my gun, but it would be useless against these creatures. We could not escape. We were terrified. Surely this was the end of our journey beneath the earth. But the sea monsters did not attack us. They attacked each other. They fought fiercely. Huge waves threw our raft up and down. The fight lasted for 2 or 3 hours. We watched in fear. Which monster would win this fight? And would it then go on to attack us? We had no chance of escaping. Suddenly, the two sea monsters disappeared beneath the sea. Then the head of one of them appeared again. It twisted its long neck from left to right. It looked as if it was in great pain. The waves rose higher and higher. Gradually, it moved more slowly. At last, it stretched out on the surface of the water. It was dead. We continued our voyage. We were glad to escape the anger of the sea monsters. For 2 days we sailed on. Then on the 3rd day we heard a roaring noise. We saw a huge fountain of water rising from the sea. It was many kilometers away. Was it another sea monster? If so, it must be even bigger than the ones we had already seen. I wanted to sail as far away as possible, but my uncle had other ideas. He told Hans to go straight ahead. As we got closer, we saw a huge dark shape in the sea. It was as high as a mountain, and at least 2 kilometers long. I was terrified. I had never seen an animal as big as this. Suddenly Hans stood up and pointed to the shape. "It's an island," he said, "and the fountain of water is a geyser." We landed on the island and began to explore it. We were careful to avoid the geyser. The ground trembled under our feet, and it was very hot. My uncle named the island after me. Soon we set sail again, leaving Axel Island behind us. After a few hours there was a change in the weather. I could see dark clouds coming towards us. Lightning flashed behind the clouds. I turned to my uncle. "There's going to be a storm," I said. "We should lower the sail and take down the mast."
"No, never,"
my uncle cried.
"Let the storm take us away."
Immediately the storm hit us. The rain poured over us. The raft was thrown up in the air. Then the wind blew us forward at a great speed. For 3 days we were at the mercy of the storm. A ball of fire suddenly appeared in the sky. It was coming straight towards us. It burst as it hit our raft. Everything was covered in blue flames. Then I fainted and remembered no more. When I woke up, the storm had stopped and the sea was calm. In front of us we could see a shore. We had crossed the Lidenbrock Sea. We landed and rested on the shore. Next morning we set out to explore the shore. We walked inland and soon came to a range of hills. The bones of extinct animals lay all around us. My uncle found the skull of a human. It was amazing. Men had lived on the shores of this sea thousands of years ago. We came to a forest of strange trees. The forest was not green, but pale yellow, like the colour of sand. The trees had no lower branches, and you could see through the forest. Suddenly I stopped, and put my hand on my uncle's arm to warn him. I could see huge shapes moving about in the trees. When I approached, I saw giant animals. They looked like elephants, but they were much bigger and they had longer tusks. I recognized them from pictures in my science books. They were mammoths, which had died out on the earth thousands of years ago. When my uncle saw them, he wanted to approach them, but I did not want to get any closer. "These animals are dangerous," I said. "No man would risk his life with them."
"You are wrong, Axel," my uncle replied. "Look over there. I can see something that looks like a man."
He pointed to one of the giant trees. A man was leaning against it. He was more than 3 meters tall, and he had long hair. He held a long stick in his hand. He was looking after the herd of mammoths, just as a shepherd looks after his flock of sheep. We stood there for a few moments, unable to believe what we had seen. But what if this giant shepherd saw us? I was afraid, and I pulled my uncle's arm. "Come on," I cried. "Back to the raft." For once my uncle did what I asked him to do. We ran as fast as we could back to the Lidenbrook Sea. Chapter 8. The Great Explosion. As I ran along the shore, I saw something shining in the sand. I bent down and picked it up. It was a knife. I showed it to my uncle.
"That is your knife, Axel. You must have dropped it."
"No, uncle. I did not bring a knife with me. What about you?"
"No,"
my uncle replied.
"I have never seen this knife before. Perhaps it belongs to Hans."
But it was not Hans's knife. My uncle picked it up and looked at it carefully.
"This knife has been here for many years,"
he said.
"It is made of steel. Therefore, it can only be a few 100 years old. But the blade of the knife is rough. Someone has used this knife to carve his name on a stone, and that stone is somewhere near here. We must find it." The 3 of us looked all over the rocks around us. At the foot of a cliff, we found the entrance to a dark tunnel. There we saw 2 letters carved on the rock. A.S. "A.S.!"
my uncle exclaimed.
"Arne Saknussemm again!"
All my doubts about our journey disappeared. A great traveller had been here before us. He had carved his initials in the rock to guide us on our way, and I was holding his knife. I forgot the dangers of our journey. I was not worried about how we would return. Now I was filled with as much excitement as my uncle. I turned to him. "Uncle, I think that something is guiding us on our journey," I said. "Let us enter this tunnel and continue to the center of the earth." We had only travelled a few meters when we came up against a huge rock. It blocked our path, so we could not continue. We looked to the left and to the right of it, but there was no way past it. "This rock must have fallen since Saknussemm was here," I said. "If we cannot break it down, we do not deserve to reach the center of the earth." Hans and I tried to break the rock with pickaxes, but it was too hard. Then I had an idea. "Gunpowder!" I exclaimed. "Let's blow it up with gunpowder." Hans made a hole in the rock with his pickaxe. We packed the hole with gunpowder. I made a long fuse out of cloth and laid it against the gunpowder. By midnight everything was ready. I wanted to light the fuse then, but my uncle refused.
"Tomorrow," he said. "We need to sleep now."
The next day was the most important day in our journey. I cannot write about it now without my heart beating with fear. At 6 o'clock I was ready to light the fuse. There would be a delay of 10 minutes before the gunpowder exploded. I told my uncle I was ready. I lit the fuse and returned to the raft. We counted the time on my uncle's watch.
5 seconds more,
he said.
4, 3, 2, 1. Now!
I don't think I heard the explosion, but the shape of the rocks changed before my eyes. A huge hole opened, and the sea became one big wave. It lifted us and threw us forward. In less than a second, we were in complete darkness. The water carried us along at a frightening speed. An hour passed, perhaps 2. We held on to each other to prevent us being thrown off the raft. It was then that I found that we had lost everything we owned, our tools and instruments, and most of our food and water had been swept away by the waves. All we had were some biscuits and a small piece of meat. I decided not to tell my uncle of my discovery. In any case, there was no point in worrying about food. We would probably be killed quite soon. We continued to go faster. It felt as if we were falling. But where were we falling? Chapter 9. In the middle of a volcano. We were going over a big waterfall. There was a huge splash as we landed. Then we rushed on as before. But now there was a change. My uncle felt it too.
"We're going up!"
he exclaimed. It was true. The water was driving us up very quickly.
"We are in a kind of chimney,"
my uncle explained.
"The water is rising and taking us with it."
But where is it taking us?
"Who knows? We must be ready for anything, so let us eat to keep our strength."
Then I had to tell my uncle that nearly all our food was gone. He said nothing, but I knew what he thought. We would never see our beloved Hamburg again. As the water drove us upwards, it got hotter. "Uncle, these rocks are burning hot, and the water is boiling. The rock walls seem to be moving." My uncle shook his head. He did not want to listen. "But look at the compass, uncle. It's going crazy." It was true. The needle of the compass was going from north to south and from east to west. My uncle looked at it with interest. He looked very excited. "What's the matter, uncle?" I asked.
"We must be in the middle of an active volcano," he said. "There's going to be an eruption, and I think it's the best thing that could happen to us. It's our only chance of returning to the surface of the earth."
I was sure now that my uncle had gone mad. However, I said nothing. There was nothing we could do. We continued our journey upwards. It got hotter and hotter. The water under the raft boiled. Flames licked the walls of the tunnel. We were pushed up with terrific force. We held on to each other and clung to the raft. The heat was unbearable now. I lost consciousness and my eyes closed. For part of that time, I have no clear memory of what happened next. I remember explosions and falling rocks. I remember the raft spinning around in circles. There were waves of red-hot lava. Ashes rained down on us. There were flames everywhere. My last memory was of Hans looking at me. His face was calm as always. There was one last explosion, and then I remembered no more. When I opened my eyes again, Hans was holding me. I was lying on a steep mountain slope. I could see the sky, so I knew that we were back on the surface of the earth. But where were we? Chapter 10. The Homecoming. "Is this Iceland?" I asked.
No.
Hans replied. He was right. The sun was very hot and the ground was dry. Above our heads was the edge of the crater. This is where the volcano had thrown us out. It was still erupting. Every 10 minutes stones were thrown out. The ground around us was shaking. When I looked down the mountain, I could see tall green trees and little gardens. Below that, I could see the blue waters of a sea or a lake. There were small boats on the water. We seemed to be on an island. In the distance, I could see the shapes of other islands. It was all very beautiful. "We must be in Asia," I exclaimed, "on the coast of India or Malaysia. We have travelled right across the world." After we had rested, we began to climb down the mountain. We descended carefully. After our adventures, we did not want to fall to our deaths. Soon we came to fields full of fruit trees. We picked the fruit and ate it. It tasted wonderful. As we were eating, a small boy appeared. He watched us eating. He looked frightened, but my uncle spoke to him.
"What is the name of this mountain, my boy?"
he asked. The boy did not reply, so my uncle asked the same question in different languages. At last he asked in Italian.
"Stromboli,"
the boy said, and ran away. Now we knew where we were. We were on a volcanic island off the south coast of Italy. We had been thrown out of the famous volcano of Stromboli. The blue waters before us were the waters of the Mediterranean Sea. What a wonderful journey we had made! We had entered the earth through the extinct volcano of Sneffels and returned through the active volcano of Stromboli. We had exchanged the cold of the north for the warmth of the south. We saw houses below us, and we walked on towards the little town. In an hour we reached the port of San Vincenzo. The people were very kind to us. They gave us food and drink. They gave us new clothes, because our old clothes were no more than rags. We were all happy to have completed our journey safely. Even Hans was smiling. After resting at San Vincenzo for 2 days, we took a boat to Messina, then another ship to Marseille in the south of France. From there we took a train through France and into Germany. On September 9th, we finally arrived home in Hamburg. The return of Professor Lidenbrock caused great excitement in Hamburg. Everyone had known of his plans to journey to the centre of the earth. Nobody had believed that it was possible. At first they still found it hard to believe, but the fact that Hans was with us changed people's minds, and there was news from Iceland about our journey. My uncle became a great man in Hamburg, and I shared a little in his glory. All our friends welcomed us back. The city held a celebration for us, where the most important people in Hamburg made speeches in our honour. My uncle told the story of our journey. After that he had to tell it again many more times. People seemed to enjoy hearing it. My uncle wrote about what he had seen. Other scientists argued with him. They did not believe such things were possible. My uncle argued with these scientists. He enjoyed himself very much. The only sorrow was that Hans decided to return to Iceland. My uncle wanted him to stay with us in Hamburg, but he refused. He wanted to go home. I was sad too. I loved the big Icelander. He was so calm and sensible. We shook hands for the last time on the ship that took him to Reykjavik, but I will never forget him.